Welcome to our final speaker series, installment in our speaker series. We've been going for, I think, for 11 weeks now. You know, every week, I think we're a little closer to the eclipse, and I don't think it's ever really going to get here, but now it's really going to get here. For those of you who have come time and again, thank you for coming. If this is your first time, thank you for coming. Our last speaker in the series will be Dr. Stephannie Gearhart from BGSU's Department of English. And she's going to be talking about these late eclipses, Shakespeare and the early modern sky. She'll be talking about her research and passion in English, William Shakespeare. Stephannie, thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Andy, and thanks to you and Kate for inviting me here tonight to talk about Shakespeare. I'm really, can you hear me? I'll speak up. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Are we okay now? Is that good? Okay, just a wave at me if you need me to speak up some more. I'm really grateful to be here. I'm grateful to have had this opportunity to think a little bit about Shakespeare and eclipses. And Amilcar, I know you gave your lecture a couple of weeks ago and you said, oh, I got so excited with all these things I found. I felt the same way. I nerded out totally. And when Andy and Kate said they could put up tonight an eclipse that Shakespeare very likely saw in London in 1605 up on the dome tonight, I nearly cried. I got so excited. So you're going to see that tonight with me. It will be, I think, very exciting. So William Shakespeare is known for many things, including quite happily for our occasion, writing about eclipses. So tonight I want to show you some places where he talks about eclipses and think a little bit too about the intersection between the arts and the sciences. I've got a lot to say, and so that I stay on track, I have divided my talk up into 3 parts. Let's see if we can get this to work. Andy, did you plug it in to the right place? Yeah, it's on and.
Burp there, like he was doing something, try again.
Nothing there. Is that on? Yes, on. Yep. Turn it off. Turn it on.
That's
technical. Okay, do I have to go the old-fashioned way and hit the thing? Okay, okay, it's a little bit less.
Every time we do a dress rehearsal,
it works. Okay. Okay, the talk is still divided into 3 parts, and I'm going to have to stand back here a little bit more than I wanted to, so I'm sorry. I'll try to make up for it here. Okay, Andy, that's not working either. The arrow buttons, they're not working. Here's right. I'm not there.
Yeah.
Problem.
Oops. Hello. Oh, okay. It's very strange. It's part sized.
Oh, I like that all in front of that. Okay, so that's working now.
Okay, hey.
Did you do the up button, the down button?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, can it, will this work too? Try this.
Oh, see that.
Okay, there we go. Okay. Should I try this?
Try that again, because
Okay,
it might be
okay.
the start and stop, right? No?
Okay. Okay, there. Yeah, I'm gonna give up on that. Okay. Still, the talk is divided into 3 parts. In the first part, part 1, I'll be thinking a little bit about the word eclipse and how it was understood in Shakespeare's era, so that we have a bit of a context for thinking about how Shakespeare might have understood eclipses. I've got nothing here again.
Visible arrows on the screen.
Okay.
Okay, so what are we
I
doing now?
clicked on the screen and it kind of brought control back.
Okay, so I need to use the mouse first before I click? Oh, wait.
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
okay. Some magic has happened. Okay, there's still 3 parts and now we're on part 2. After we think about what eclipse might have meant to Shakespeare and his contemporaries, I'll show you some examples of where in Shakespeare we see the word eclipse show up, and we'll think a little bit about his attitude toward eclipses. That then will lead us to ask some questions about the world beyond his text. And that will lead us to part 3, where we will think a little bit about how Shakespeare and his contemporaries were engaging with the scientific debates of their era. So we will think a little bit about the relationship between the imaginary text and the so-called real world. And specifically, I'd like to think a little bit about the questions that Shakespeare was wrestling with. And those are, how much influence were the skies believed to have over humans? And what did Shakespeare think about that? And if you can hang on this long through these 3 parts, I promise a coda that will answer the question you might be asking even right now, which is, so what? Why should I care about what Shakespeare wrote 400 years ago about eclipses? What does it have to do with me? So I promise I will get you there, provided this clicker keeps working anyway. Okay, so let's begin by asking what seems to be, I think, a relatively straightforward question, but becomes a little bit more complicated after we scratch the surface. And that is, what did Shakespeare understand by the word eclipse? What did it mean to Shakespeare? So the history of language, I think, is really, really interesting. And I'd like to begin by thinking about the etymology of the word eclipse. What I mean by that in this case is to think a little bit about the origin of the word, about when it was first recorded as having been used in English, and how its meaning has changed over time. So eclipse can be a noun or a verb. Here we go. As a noun, as early as the 14th century, it meant something very similar to how we might define it today. And that is, and this comes from the Oxford English Dictionary, which is a really great resource. And if you're a word nerd like me, this is like the best thing ever. And I'm happy to show you how to use it sometime if you want. At any rate, as early as the 14th century, we see eclipse being understood as an interception or obscuration of the light of the sun, the moon, or other luminous body by the intervention of some other body, either between it and the eye, or between the luminous body and that illuminated by it. The first time we see it in print in this sense in English is in 1374, when Geoffrey Chaucer, the father of English literature, used it in his translation of Boethius. Also, as a noun, as early as the 16th century, it meant obscuration, obscurity, dimness, loss of brilliance or splendor. Perhaps unsurprisingly then, as a verb, eclipse referred to the action of a luminous body being darkened by another body. So for example, in the later part of the 17th century, John Milton, the poet, describes the night hag when called in secret, riding through the air she comes to dance with Lapland witches while the laboring moon eclipses at their charms. So in this case, the word means to suffer eclipse, to be eclipsed. So the moon is going into darkness. Put another way here, eclipse is to cause an obscuration of some other heavenly body by passing between it and the spectator, or between it and the source from which it derives its light. So the action of the thing we were just talking about. Beginning in the 16th century, we also see eclipse appear as a verb, meaning to cast a shadow upon, to throw into the shade, to obscure, or deprive of luster. In the late 16th century, Roger Goad, a theologian, notes the glory of it was eclipsed, sort of thrown into a shadow. a century later, English writer John Dryden would say, "I confess I was a little eclipsed, but I'll cheer up." And I'd like to start using this in my daily speech. I feel a little eclipsed, but it'll be okay soon, right? A little bit later in the 17th century, as a verb, eclipse also meant to hide or to screen from or to extinguish life. And this is what Shakespeare means when he has a character called Talbot in the first part of Henry VI say to his child this: "Then here I take my leave of thee, fair son, born to eclipse thy life this afternoon." And I would point out that this is a nice little play on words. He's talking to his male child, his son, but he's also, if you think the word son sounds like S-U-N as well, and he's talking about an eclipse, which is nice. Anyway, that's a lot to take in, but the bottom line here is this: we can think about eclipse as a noun or a verb, as a thing or an action, and we can also think about it in literal or metaphorical terms. So for example, in Milton's passage that I showed you a minute ago, the moon is involved in an eclipse. Literally, it's getting darkened. And we could think about eclipse as metaphorical, as in something is like an eclipse. So in this example from Shakespeare that you're looking at now, death is like an eclipse because it is, we might say, the ultimate darkness. Speaking metaphorically and hyperbolically, with his references grounded in the literal heavenly bodies, is in the 17th century one of my favorite poets, John Donne. And if it's helpful to think about this, Shakespeare was born in 1564 and he died in 1616. So you can see Donne is a contemporary. So I'm going to talk about Donne a little bit tonight. He was living and writing at the same time as Shakespeare. In one of Donne's poems called The Sun Rising, he has a great usage of the term eclipse. Here in this poem, the narrator, the speaker, is in bed with his lover and the morning comes and he doesn't want to leave her. How many of you have read Romeo and Juliet? This is a little bit like that moment where Juliet is like, "Oh, please don't get out of bed. Please pretend that it's the nightingale and not the lark, right, that's singing outside." It's sort of that situation. In this case, though, the male narrator is upset with the sun that is intruding into the bedroom and sort of saying, like, it's time to get up. And so he addresses the sun and he says this: "Thy beams so reverent and strong, why shouldst thou think I could eclipse and cloud them with a wink, but that I would not lose her sight so long?" So here the speaker addresses the sun, asking why it should think it is so powerful. Because he has a really clever way of making it disappear, making it no longer the bright, strong signal that his time in bed is over. All he has to do to eclipse or make dark the sun is to, he says, with a wink. And in this period, a wink would have been closing both of your eyes. So he just has to close both his eyes. That'll show the sun. He's not going to tell me to get out of bed. But if you look at that last line that I have up there, you see that there's a little bit of a problem there. See the word but? So I do that. I shut my eyes to block out the sun. But of course, when I do that, I also block out my beloved. So because he wants to keep seeing her and because he wants to stay in bed, he has to attempt a kind of different strategy with the sun. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. At any rate, this word eclipse for Shakespeare could be a verb. It could be a noun. It could be used literally. It could be used metaphorically. In terms of its origin, if you were here for the earlier eclipse show, you heard this in the presentation. Eclipse derives in part from this Greek word eclipsis. And this is a word that means to leave out or to pass over. The prefix ek is out of or away from, and the verb is lepo. It means to leave. And depending on the context, this word eclipsis could be quite neutral, as in simply like going out, going away from. It can, though, be more dire, as in forsaking, abandoning, ceasing, or perhaps even dying. And I have to pause to give credit to Dr. Phil Peake in classics, who helped me through this bit of my research, because it was literally all Greek to me, and he really helped me through it. So here it is. The related word, which is now obsolete, is this word, eclipsis. And this word refers to the grammatical figure of omission. And that sounds like a horribly scary and strange thing that I've just said, but you may know it as the word we know now, ellipsis, those little dots, you know, when you're quoting something and you leave out a chunk of text and you put those dots. So this word ellipsis comes from eclipsis, which is the word Shakespeare would have understood. It means something's missing, something's removed, something's gone. In the 16th century in England, this punctuation was recognized similarly to how we recognize it today. This guy here in the late part of the 16th century, George Putnam, notes that if one word or some little portion of speech be wanting, that means lacking or missing, it may be supplied by ordinary understanding virtue of the figure. And by the figure here, he means the eclipses. So here, again, it symbolizes a lack, something that's gone missing. And we start to see this grammatical figure in printed versions of plays in England in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. And it shows up there, instead of 3 little dots, it shows up there as 3 little dashes. It's called the eclipses, and it shows up as 3 little dashes. I'm going to show you a couple of examples in King Lear here. Maybe I'll just focus on the second one for our purposes. That should be enough. Where one character, Regan, is asking another character, Gloucester, wherefore to Dover? Wast thou not charged at peril? And then we get the 3 little dashes, the eclipses. She's about to continue to ask a second question. Her husband interrupts her and says, wherefore to Dover? Let him answer that first. So her words are gone. They're eclipsed. They are taken away by someone else there. As one scholar has observed, in a tragedy like King Lear, the punctuation of eclipses makes forms of loss in the play textually present. So there's a lot of loss in King Lear, loss of accord and tolerance between characters, loss of the whole self, finally in death, loss of eyes. Sorry, that's a spoiler alert, I guess, if you haven't read it. Someone loses their eyes in King Lear. There's a lot of loss, and the bottom line is we see the eclipses, this figure, quite a lot. And it resonates with the idea of the eclipse, which was viewed in the era as a loss, as an absence, as a darkness. I'm going to return to King Lear in a little bit because I think it's a great example of how Shakespeare was engaged with scientific debates of his day. Before I do, though, I want to show you some more examples of literal and metaphorical references to eclipses in Shakespeare's work. So we're on to part 2, and this thing is still working. I think this is, I'm very, very happy. Yeah, I know. It's like, I just sit down now. I feel like my job is done. So just after strangling his wife, I've got no good segue to that one. Just after strangling his wife in the play that bears his name, Othello is very, very distraught. He is alone and he's struggling with what he has done. He loved his wife, Desdemona, dearly. He's tricked into believing she's unfaithful to him. He struggles before wondering, you know, should I kill her? Should I not? He's very upset after he kills her. He laments what he's done. He is torn. He's in psychological distress. And in this moment alone, he addresses the skies, or rather references the skies. He says this, my wife, I have no wife. Oh, insupportable, oh, heavy hour. Methinks it should be now a huge eclipse of sun and moon, and that the affrighted globe did yawn at alteration. So there's a lot going on here. Othello, for one thing, refers to the image of the eclipse in order to express a sense of mental darkness or distress. And this is a time when his mind, his heart, his soul, whatever you'd like to call it, is in great pain. Like an eclipse makes the world around one dark, so too has his action, this murder, made him feel lost or distressed or in darkness. It's also worth noting here, I think, that in that first line, he both admits to having a wife, my wife, he says, and to her absence, I have no wife. That is, he's married, but his spouse is lying dead before him. So she is both present and absent. And it's similar, I think, to the heavenly luminous body that is blocked out during an eclipse. It's both there and not there, a kind of paradox. Othello is also gesturing here toward an early modern belief in the relationship between the microcosm and the macrocosm. That is the little world of humans, micro, and the larger world of the universe and nature, macro. Othello, an individual man, has done a bad deed, and he expects that a similarly catastrophic event will be happening in nature to parallel it. And here he thinks those will be eclipses of the sun and moon. And he also says the affrighted the affrighted globe did yawn at alteration. Does anyone want to take a guess at what he's talking about there? What other sort of natural disaster? It would be like, like if the earth is yawning, what natural disaster might it be?
Either
like probably an earthquake. Yeah, an earthquake. Yeah, I mean, think about the yawn, right? What a yawn looks like if the earth were to yawn. Yeah, so it's an earthquake. So he thinks like really bad things in nature, in the universe, should be happening to parallel what's going on in the bedroom. This idea that there was a correspondence between the microcosm and the macrocosm, it was prevalent in Shakespeare's era. The idea did not go unchallenged, which I'll talk about in a minute. But first, let me show you another example in another of Shakespeare's tragedies, Macbeth, where this notion that when something bad is happening in the little world of man, something bad is happening in the bigger world as well. So in Macbeth, the titular character kills the king, Duncan, in order to take the throne. And to King James I, who was on the throne when Shakespeare wrote the play, the monarch was God's anointed. He was sort of next in line to God on earth. And so to kill the king, to commit regicide is very, very bad. And the characters in Macbeth illustrate this. I'm going to show you a little back and forth between two characters so you can see just how upsetting this act is to the characters in the play. So this one character, Ross, says, by the clock 'tis day, and yet dark night strangles the traveling lamp. Is it night's predominance of the day's shame that darkness does the face of earth and tomb when living light should kiss it? And the guy he's talking to, the old man, says, 'tis unnatural, even like the deed that's done. On Tuesday last, a falcon towering in her pride of place was by a mousing owl hawked at and killed. And Duncan's horses, Ross goes on to say, a thing most strange and certain, beauteous and swift, the minions of their race, turned wild in nature, broke their stalls, flung out, contending against obedience, as they would make war with mankind. 'Tis said they ate each other. They did too, to the amazement of mine eyes that looked upon it. It's such a weird moment. I know you're laughing, Ash, because it's so weird. It's a really weird moment. There's a lot of weird stuff going on here. So let's maybe look at this. For one thing, we've got animals acting against their nature. Those horses, who are well-behaved, beautiful creatures, have bust out of their stalls. They're running around like mad. And really weirdly, they become cannibals. We also hear, if I can go back here to this previous slide, we also hear that predators are becoming prey. That falcon, that hits a bit close to home here, I think, at BGSU, that falcon should be killing things, not being killed, and certainly not by a mousing owl who should be eating little tiny creatures. Everything seems to be turned upside down here. If we go back to those first lines that I read from Ross, the clock says it's daytime, but the sky has gone dark, as in the case of a solar eclipse. And this situation is not expressed in neutral terms by these characters. Rather, we hear that dark night strangles the traveling lamp. Anyone want to guess about the traveling lamp? What's that? Lamp put on an airplane and sent away. I don't know. What do we think it is? It's the sun. Okay, so the sun traveling in the sky. I want to come back to that idea in a little bit. It's an interesting way of thinking about what the sun is doing up there. Strangles is an interesting choice of words, a violent word. It's one that brings us back to Othello, who references eclipses just after having strangled his wife. Ross also underscores how bad the situation is with his follow-up questions. Look at that third line down. Is it night's predominance or the day's shame? There he's asking, has night gained dominance over day such that it will be dark forever? Or is it that the act that has happened, the regicide, the murder of the king, is so shameful that day is trying to hide itself in darkness? That question's never answered, but I would note before we move away from this example that light is meant to kiss the face of the earth. If you think about that verb for just a minute, kiss. Instead, light has lost out to darkness, which is said to entomb the earth or put it in a tomb. That's how bad it is, Ross is trying to tell us. Having said all that, perhaps it's no surprise that in this same play, eclipses are associated with some pretty upsetting characters, the witches. And these characters are very unsettling to the main character in the play and would have been possibly unsettling to the audience watching the play, and certainly were unsettling to King James I. There was some debate in the period about the veracity of witches, but James certainly believed in them and he feared them greatly. He led robust witch hunts in Scotland before becoming the King of England, and he wrote a book called demonology, which argued for taking witches very seriously and for punishing them very severely. So in Macbeth, the witches are like the deed that's done, in that they are shown to be unnatural. They don't fit into binary categories that characters in the play understand. Are they corporeal, that is bodily, or are they spiritual? Are they male? Are they female? Are they fair? Are they foul? And they are certainly instrumental in encouraging Macbeth to pursue regicide. The witches, when adding ingredients to their cauldron, include slips of yew slivered in the moon's eclipse. And those are just a couple little words, but within that tiny little bit that I've taken from a longer speech, you can hear those S's and they sound a bit sinister, a bit snaky. Slips of yew slivered in the moon's eclipse. That is, they've gone out, cut little bits off a yew tree, Y-E-W, a yew tree, during an eclipse of the moon. So they're gathering their ingredients in a kind of sinister, ominous setting under the cover of darkness, which is perhaps fitting for these weird sisters. Associating eclipses with negative things like witches and homicide is actually quite common in the period. And we see it associated with many negative things. And we see Shakespeare sort of addressing this in his sonnets as well as in his plays. So sonnet 35, for example, starts like this. No more be grieved at that which thou hast done. Roses have thorns and silver fountains mud. Clouds and eclipses stain both moon and sun, and loathsome canker lives in sweetest bud. So in these lines, we hear the narrator telling his beloved not to be upset by some bad deed he has done. And why not? Because even the loveliest things sometimes encounter things that are unlovely, that compromise their beauty. Roses, thorns, fountains, mud, flowers, cankers, and of course, the moon and sun, clouds, and eclipses. And so here the eclipse is the thing that dims the luminous body's beauty. Even more ominous, though, than just getting in the way of beauty, eclipses were believed by many to be the augurs of bad tidings. And to return to an earlier point, to be indicative of the correspondence between the microcosm, the little world of humans, and the macrocosm. In King Lear, for example, we hear Gloucester lamenting about the wretched state of the kingdom in these very terms. Here's where the title of the lecture comes to, if you're interested. Gloucester says this: these late eclipses in the sun and moon portend no good to us. Though the wisdom of nature can reason it thus and thus, yet nature finds itself scourged by the sequent effects. Love cools, friendship falls off, brothers divide. In cities, mutinies, in countries, discord. In palaces, treason, and the bond cracked twixt son and father. This villain of mine, he's talking here about his son, who he thinks is out to kill him. This villain of mine comes under the prediction, there's son against father. The king falls from bias of nature, there's father against child. He's referring there to King Lear, who's just rejected his favored child, kicked her out of the kingdom. We've seen the best of our time. Machinations, hollowness, treachery, and all ruinous disorders follow us disquietly to our graves. So Gloucester's point here is that the solar and lunar eclipses that have occurred recently are portents of bad things. It doesn't matter, he says, if people like Andy and people like Kate, scientists can reason it thus and thus, all they want. They can explain to us why this is happening. It doesn't matter. Because humans are still being afflicted by the effects of these eclipses, and those effects are bad. Love and friendship wane, brothers fight with each other, citizens mutiny, people become traitors, children and parents are at odds. And in typical grumpy old man fashion, Gloucester just concludes it's all going to hell in a handbasket. Those last couple of lines, machinations, hollowness, treachery, ruinous disorder, it's all we've got left, and they'll kill us. We've seen the best of our times. Around the time that Shakespeare was writing this play, King Lear, and probably Othello as well, in London, he could have seen a total, well, partial, I think. I don't think it's quite total. Was it 70%? Is that what I understand?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it almost total, I guess, solar eclipse. And I want to show you that eclipse of 1605 as it was visible in the capital city to give you a sense of what Gloucester's referencing and what Shakespeare himself might have seen as he was thinking about this. And while we watch this eclipse, I'm going to read to you a text published in 1604, not by Shakespeare, by some anonymous guy, he's predicting the bad things that are going to happen because there'll be many great eclipses in the early part of the 17th century. So let's look at that eclipse and I'll read to you the predictions. Andy, I don't know how to turn that thing off. I'm sorry to say. Yeah, sorry. Thank you. Okay, so there it is. So let me read to you from certain wonderful predictions for 7 years showing the strange and wonderful comets and meteors beginning this present year, 1604. Yes, the longer your title was in the 17th century, the better your book was. Okay, so this guy says there'll be many great eclipses whereby grievous and most wretched accidents are presaged. Perhaps, he says, these be the latter days when as all piety and charity shall wax cold, truth and justice shall be oppressed, and all things else shall be mixed, disturbed, and turned upside down, and the forepart set behind by torments and seditions. And finally, nothing else shall be expected but the spoil and ruin of the common society. He goes on a little bit later to list a bunch of bad things he thinks are going to happen, including this: death unto cattle, the exile of a great king or prince, imprisonments or death, hate between the commons and the greater sort, mutual hates and differences, motions of great oaths and horrible wars, manslaughters, fire, thievery, rapines and depopulations, untimely births, agues, pestilences, hot infirmities, death and barrenness of fruits, thefts and robberies, grievous sicknesses, diseases, and tempestuous and most pernicious winds. That I always feel is something we know here: tempestuous and most pernicious winds. That's Bowling Green, Ohio. Yeah. So this is the eclipse Shakespeare likely saw around the time he's writing the things I'm citing now to you. Anyone need to look at that eclipse longer, or can I turn the lights back on? Are we okay? Okay, Kate, I think we're good. Thank you. So for this author, and oh, where'd he go? Sorry.
He's coming up.
Is he coming back? Okay.
Here he comes.
Okay, here he comes. Okay, he's coming in slowly. There he is. So for this author and for the character Gloucester, there's a strong and upsetting connection between the microcosm and the macrocosm. It's a belief that was echoed by other of Shakespeare's characters. I'll give you one other example. In Troilus and Cressida, a character called Ulysses argues that typically the heavens themselves, the planets in this center, observe degree, priority, and place, all in line of order. However, sometimes things get out of order. And he goes on to say, when the planets in evil mixture to disorder wonder, what plagues and what portents, what mutiny, what raging of the sea, shaking of the earth, commotion in the winds, frights, changes, horrors, take but degree away, untune that string, and hark what discord follows. The bounded waters should lift their bosom higher than the shore and make a sop of this solid globe, and the rude sun should strike his father dead. So here we see Ulysses fearing the plagues, the mutinies, the weather-related disasters, what we would call climate change. Do you see those couple of lines? He's imagining that the waters have bosoms that will be lifted higher than the shores to make a sop of the earth. A sop is like if you take a piece of bread, a little tiny piece of bread, and put it in a glass of wine and try to take it out again. That's a sop, what the bread has become. So he's imagining that all of those things are going to happen because the planets aren't in the right spot. And when they're not, humans don't stand a chance. There'll be natural disasters, the shaking of the earth, and corresponding social disasters. The rude sun will strike his father dead. This, though, was not the only way of seeing things in the period. Gloucester's son, Edmund, in King Lear, responds to his father's assessment of things in a very critical way. He's very critical about his dad's way of thinking about planetary influence on humans' lives. So after Gloucester has lamented about how everything is awful due to the late eclipses in the sun and moon, Edmund, and I would note here that Edmund is a character who was conceived out of wedlock. That would have been a big deal to people in the period and the characters in the play, and he reminds us a lot of that. When he's alone, he makes these remarks. This, he said, the way my father's thinking about how it works, this is the excellent foppery of the world, that when we are sick in fortune, often the surfeits of our own behavior, we make guilty of our disasters the sun, the moon, and the stars, as if we were villains on necessity, fools by heavenly compulsion, knaves, thieves, and treachers by spherical predominance. Drunkards, liars, and adulterers by an enforced obedience of planetary influence, and all that we are evil in by a divine thrusting on. An admirable evasion of a whoremaster man to lay his goatish disposition on the charge of a star. My father compounded with my mother under the dragon's tail, and my nativity was under Ursa Major, so that it follows I am rough and lecherous. But, he says, I should have been that I am, had the maidenliest star in the firmament twinkled on my bastardizing. So Edmund's complaint here is that his father is relying on a system that allows people to be absolved of responsibility for their behavior. And he gives several general examples, including that if humans are fools, idiots, thieves, traitors, adulterers, alcoholics, liars, you name it, it's the fault of the heavens. Gloucester had sex with a woman he wasn't married to, and Edmund was the result. But Edmund says his father shouldn't be able to get away with laying his goatish disposition, blaming the stars, laying that on the charge of a star. Edmund also takes issue with the circumstances of his conception and his birth. Some say that because he was conceived under the dragon's tail, he was destined to be a badly behaved human being. Now, while there is some critical debate about what the dragon's tail refers to, Andy and I had this conversation because it was unclear to me what it referred to. I got out about 6 editions of King Lear and I put them on the floor of my office and I read them, and I found someone who I think agrees with you, and I think it's the most convincing reading, which is that the dragon's tail is referring to Draco, the constellation. So I did find an editor who agrees that's the case. Calling it that would have invoked sort of the devil. He was often thought of as a snake or a dragon. Ursa Major here is referred to. That is the greater bear, which would have signified to the audience an animal that was rough and lecherous. So the idea here is that the stars predicted what Edmund would be, and he would be a pretty bad guy. But Edmund says none of this matters. It didn't matter which stars or planets were in the sky and where they were when he was created, when he was birthed. He chooses his own destiny. Edmund's descent here can be understood, I think, in the context of scientific debates in Shakespeare's era. And at the heart of these debates is the question, what is the relationship between humans and the universe? And I think the question is two-pronged. First, it concerns an early modern understanding of the universe. And secondly, it concerns people's understanding of just how much or how little humans were aligned with or influenced by that universe. So I'd like to take the first part of that first. And that brings us to the third part of the talk, and the clicker is still working. Again, I'm very excited by this. I think we can, I don't want to say anything too soon. I think we can get through it though. So to think about early modern understanding of the universe, I want to return to John Donne, who wrote a lengthy poem at the beginning of the 17th century that was called An Anatomy of the World, the first anniversary. This poem is ostensibly about the death of the daughter of Donne's patron. And in the poem, the daughter Elizabeth is conflated with the long reigning Queen Elizabeth I, whose recent death at the turn of the 17th century was a shock to many. In Donne's poem, he expresses a sense that with the deaths of these Elizabeths comes disorder of the entire universe. And when we think of Elizabeth, the queen, it's a pretty conceit. She who had been on the throne for so long, who had held together political, religious, social order, if she's gone and we think about the monarch as God's anointed, it maybe makes kind of some sense that maybe the universe would be disordered. Donne writes it like this: she that had all magnetic force alone to draw and fasten sundered parts in one is gone. So the whole world is falling apart. She was like a magnet who could hold it all together, and now she's gone, and that magnet is gone. In the poem, Donne catalogs just how bad things are. First, saying that humans are on the decline. They don't live as long as they used to. They're physically smaller and weaker now, and their minds are not as sharp as they once had been. He says this: she's dead, she's dead. When thou knowest this, thou knowest how poor a trifling thing man is. And here's the connection between the microcosm and the macrocosm. As mankind, so is the world's whole frame quite out of joint. So as mankind, so is the world a mess. So there's this profound connection, again, between humans and the wider universe. And at this point in the poem is where we can see that Elizabeth, the young woman, or the queen, or both of them, is kind of a convenient metaphor for what's really bugging Donne. The poet reveals about 200 lines in or so that it's really the scientific developments of the 17th century that are upsetting him a lot. They are altering the way in which humans think about how the universe is set up and what their place is in it. And he writes this. He says, new philosophy calls all in doubt. The element of fire is quite put out. The sun is lost and the earth, and no man's wit can well direct him where to look for it. And freely men confess that this world's spent when in the planets and the firmament they seek so many new. They see that this is crumbled out again to his atomies or his atoms. So here, Donne expresses concern about the new philosophy. And when he's talking about that, he's referencing a new model of the universe that challenged the way people had thought about it earlier. So earlier cosmology, as many of you probably know, was geocentric. It had the earth at the center and was associated most famously with Ptolemy and Aristotle before him. For Ptolemy, the cosmos consisted of celestial spheres, and there were sort of two spatial domains, the sublunary, below the moon, under the moon, and the heavens. Both were surrounded by a sphere of fixed stars, fixed as in they were sort of in a solid sphere that sort of moved around. In the 16th century, however, Copernicus pushes the boat out with a heliocentric model that puts the sun at the center of the universe. And it puts the earth in motion around the sun and includes a sphere of fixed stars that is stationary. So I'm not an expert in the history of science, but what is interesting to me about the history of science is this guy right here, Thomas Digges, who in 1576 takes Copernicus's ideas and translates them into English. And his choice of English rather than Latin is the really interesting thing here, because it suggests he was aiming at an ordinary educated audience rather than just fellow scientists who across Europe would have been speaking to each other in Latin. So this is to say that someone like Shakespeare might very likely have been familiar with these radical new ideas. Copernicus's theory kicks off the scientific revolution, and in this context, Tycho Brahe threw his hat in the ring, offering a kind of hybrid model where the sun orbited the earth and the planets orbited the sun. He observed new stars, which would have rocked the worlds of people who thought that the skies were unchanging. Around this time, we have Kepler and Galileo looking through telescopes and reporting on what they were seeing. And we also have the Englishman Sir Francis Bacon proposing a scientific method for the methodical examination of just about everything. So yes, the new philosophy, when Shakespeare was alive, called all in doubt. Where was the sun? Where was the earth? Was there a realm of fire beyond the stars that made them bright? Could new stars appear? Could old ones die out? This was a distinct possibility, says Donne, when he writes this. And in those constellations, there arise new stars, and old do vanish from our eyes, as though heaven suffered earthquakes, peace or war, when new towns rise and old demolished are. So the heavens had been thought to be stable, not subject to change, but Tycho, for one, discovered new stars in the late 16th century, which again upset the idea that the heavens were also subject to decay as man, as humans, as the earth were. Tycho's observations also led him to conclude that there were no fixed solid orbs or spheres holding the heavens, or in the heavens holding the planets and stars in one place. This then led Thomas Digges and Giordano Bruno to argue that the universe was in fact infinite rather than finite, which is what some others before, including Aristotle, had argued. And we hear Hamlet gesture toward this new philosophy when he says, "Oh God, I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself a king of infinite space, were it not that I have bad dreams." So at any rate, Donne's poem, Anatomy of the World, he's fretting about this new model of the universe. And this change-up is very distressing to him. And he sees a correspondence between the microcosm and the macrocosm. He writes, "'Tis all in pieces, all coherence gone, all just supply and all relation, prince, subject, father, son, are things forgot. For every man alone thinks he hath got to be a phoenix, and that there can be none of that kind of which he is but he." So all traditional relationships are upended as quite literally the entire universe has been inverted. This is done. Subjects should bow to princes, sons to their fathers, but it's not happening anymore. And what follows is unbridled chaos and individualism as relationships that once kept social order are destroyed as a revisioning of the universe is coming into view. So that's done. He's clearly aware of contemporary debates in science, but there's some disagreement over whether Shakespeare was paying attention or not to these things. And I'll come back to that in just a little bit. Donne is really gloomy in this poem, and in a companion poem, he concludes that the world is, quote, fragmentary rubbish. I mean, he's pretty down on the sort of state of affairs at the turn of the 17th century. But he's much more playful in The Sun Rising, which we looked at earlier. If you remember this poem where the speaker's in bed and he tries to eclipse the sun, and then he has the problem where he's like, I can't see the woman I'm with, this is a problem. So he takes this different tactic. He says this to the sun: if her eyes have not blinded thine, he's talking to the sun here, look, and tomorrow late, tell me whether both the Indias of spice and mine be thou where thou left'st them, or lie here with me. Ask for those kings whom thou saw'st yesterday, and thou shalt hear all here in one bed lay. She is all states and all princes, I, nothing else is. Princes do but play us. Compared to this, all honors mimic, all wealth alchemy. Thou, son, art half as happy as we, and that the world's contracted thus. Thine age asks ease, and since thy duties be to warm the world, that's done in warming us. Since here to us, and thou art everywhere, this bed thy center is, these walls thy sphere. So first here, Donne is extreme in his compliments to his beloved. Her eyes are so bright they might blind the sun. If you look at those first couple of lines, that's what he's getting at there. And after that, he tells the sun to go and look around the world. Look and see if the spice mines of India, if kings of various countries are where you left them yesterday. The implicit answer here is no, they're not. And why not? Because they're all here in this bed. This bed is the entire world. The speaker and his beloved are the entire world. As a result, the sun should be happy. He's old, and old age asks ease. And if his job is to warm the world, hurrah, that's done in warming the lovers in bed. He doesn't have to go anywhere. He can just have a break. The bed here with the world in it is imagined to be the sun's center. And the walls of the room are imagined to be the sun's sphere. So this suggests a geocentric model with the world at the center. And with a solid sphere, a fixed sphere that holds the planets and the stars in place. Now, Donne finds a lot of comfort in this model. For one thing, it keeps him from having to get out of bed with his lover. And for another thing, as in the other poem, it's just comforting to think like, oh, the world is arranged like this. This is how the world's arranged, and I don't have to be pressured to think of it in some other way. So at any rate, yes, Donne has an opinion here on the scientific debates of his day. Shakespeare, what was he up to? Well, sometimes it seems that Shakespeare is only aware of a Ptolemaic universe. That is the one with the earth at the center, with solid, impenetrable, immutable spheres holding the planets and stars in place. However, when we look a little bit closer, as some scholars have noticed, when Shakespeare refers to spheres, and he does this 23 times in his plays, only two of them, oh, there he goes, there he is. Only two of them are Ptolemaic, and those references come in Antony and Cleopatra and Troilus and Cressida. And it's interesting, I think, that these are two plays that are set in antiquity, which might suggest that Shakespeare sees the Ptolemaic model as being a bit old-fashioned. Most of the time, though, when Shakespeare comments on the skies, he does display an awareness of these more recent scientific debates. He's aware, for instance, that stars could possibly jump out of their spheres. They could move, they could go somewhere. For example, let me give you an example here. Hamlet, in his love letter to Ophelia, writes this: doubt thou the stars are fire, doubt that the sun doth move, doubt truth to be a liar, but never doubt I love. So the Ptolemaic model had the sun circling the earth as a wandering star, and advanced the idea that the Empyrean had pure fire that illuminated those stars. But did the sun move around the earth? I mean, that was a question scientists and educated people were asking in this period. Hamlet allows that Ophelia might wonder about it too. She can doubt the Ptolemaic model and maybe lean toward a Copernican model. That's fine. But Hamlet insists that unlike the debatable nature of the skies, his love is true and real and unchanging. Spoiler alert, it's not. But if you haven't read the play, sorry, it doesn't go very well for these two or for anyone really. In another example of fated, doomed love, here we are, Romeo and Juliet. In this play, we hear Romeo carrying on about how beautiful his girlfriend is, and he refers to the skies. Two of the fairest stars in all the heaven, having some business, do entreat her eyes, that's Juliet's eyes, to twinkle in their spheres till they return. So here we have the idea that stars can move out of their spheres. In this case, they have some other business to tend to, and they need a substitute. And since Juliet's eyes are so bright, they can just sort of be the substitute for those stars. And again, this challenges the Ptolemaic model in which there were fixed spheres, unmovable, immutable bodies in the sky. And again, if we can return to Hamlet, we see a similar thing here when Hamlet's father comes back as a ghost and says to his son, but that I am forbid to tell the secrets of my prison house, I could a tale unfold, whose lightest word would harrow up thy soul, freeze thy young blood, and make thy two eyes like stars start from their spheres. Again, as in Romeo and Juliet, here we see eyes compared to stars, and we see again that those stars or those eyes can start, they can jump, they can move out of their spheres, out of their eye sockets. And in fact, Shakespeare uses the word unsphered and he uses the word disorbed many, many times in his plays. Scholars who've taken note of Shakespeare's use of these terms make a very strong case, I think anyway, that it's not right to call Shakespeare either Ptolemaic or Copernican, that's a bit too simplistic. Rather, Shakespeare's work includes, as plays naturally do, multiple voices, multiple positions. It seems that Shakespeare realized there was a debate going on in the world around him, and his characters are kind of having that debate as well. So the next part of understanding Shakespeare's relationship to the skies is to consider just how much influence the stars have over human lives. Are we fated, or can we fight against fate? How much are human beings subject to external conditioning, and how much do they have potential for independent action, in other words? These were key questions in the era, and the debate shows up in Shakespeare's works. Sometimes planetary influence seems inevitable. How about this? A pair of star-crossed lovers take their lives. This is the 6th line of the prologue of the play. We already know what's happening. It's fated. It's done. Romeo and Juliet cannot fight this. Similarly, in Julius Caesar, Cassius tells Brutus, the fault is not in us, dear Brutus, but in our stars that we are underlings. So again, you can't fight fate. We are underlings. We are not in charge because it's written in the stars. We can't really do anything. Other times, though, we hear from characters who suggest that, in fact, we can do something, that we can shape our own destinies. And I would return to Edmund's speech earlier that we looked at, where he just says, it doesn't matter what stars are in the sky, and you got to quit blaming the sky for your behavior. Take control of your destiny. I'm doing that. Edmund is, as I mentioned earlier, and he reminds us multiple times in the play that he's a bastard. He was born out of wedlock. He's sort of on the outside of the world of the play. As a result, he can see things and say things that other characters kind of cannot. He can voice unpopular or dissonant positions. And it's not to say that the play necessarily condemns or condones those positions, but it does give voice to them. And we might consider that once a position is voiced, it cannot be unheard. Coming at it from a slightly different position, but asking sort of a similar question to Edmund, is Shakespeare in his sonnets. And so to kind of wrap this up, if you're still out there, to kind of wrap this up, I want to look at 2 sonnets and then answer your so what question. So Shakespeare does ask these questions. Are we fated? Can we fight against what seems to be inevitable, what seems to be written in the stars? Well, in sonnet 14, he writes this. Not from the stars do I my judgment pluck, and yet methinks I have astronomy, but not to tell of good or evil luck, of plagues, of dearths, or seasons' quality. Nor can I fortune to brief minutes tell, pointing to each thunder, wind, and rain, or say with princes if it shall go well, by oft predict that I in heaven find. But from thine eyes my knowledge I derive, and constant stars, in them I read such art as truth and beauty shall together thrive, if from thyself to store thou wouldst convert. Or else of thee this I prognosticate, thy end is truth's and beauty's doom and date. So here is Shakespeare's singular use of the term astronomy, which sort of seems conflated with our ideas about astrology, because he's saying you could pluck predictions from the skies. If we have a little more time and anyone's interested, I did nerd out and get the OED's definition of these terms in the period. They're very, very similar, even if you just look at number 2. Astronomy is defined as the art of astrology, practiced as a means of predicting human affairs, and astrology is the practical application of the medieval art or science of astronomy. So they're sort of hard to pull apart in this era. At any rate, here he is talking, the narrator is saying, I don't look to the skies to make these predictions, and yet I still have a kind of astronomy, a way of predicting the future. And this astronomy is not based in the stars in the skies, but again, in someone's eyes, in a young man's eyes. And it's there in the eyes that he sees the future, and the future is certain. The eyes are the constant stars that he reads as an astronomer might read the stars in the sky. He says, those stars tell me that death and decay are going to come for you. And truth and beauty and you will be destroyed if you don't have a child to pass your beauty on to. And that's an argument he's been making for like 13 sonnets already. So we're kind of just getting that again. In the following sonnet, in sonnet 15, however, he starts to make a different argument. And this is one, it's kind of like the springboard for the next sonnets that come. It's an interesting moment in the sequence. He starts to argue against the stars. He starts to say, I can fight the stars. And we sort of glimpse it here. He says, when I consider everything that grows holds imperfection but a little moment, that this huge stage presenteth naught but shows whereon the stars in secret influence comment. When I perceive that men as plants increase, cheered and checked even by the self-same sky, vaunt in their youthful sap at height decrease, and wear their brave state out of memory. Then the conceit of this inconstant stay sets you most rich in youth before my sight, where wasteful time debateth with decay to change your day of youth to sullied night. And all in war with time, for love of you, as he takes from you, I engraft you new. So there's a lot going on here. I'm just going to comment on a couple of things. Here, the narrator acknowledges the theater world connection, as he suggests that life on Earth is just a show influenced by the stars above, and that those stars dictate that men are youthful and beautiful, and then they fall and decay and are lost to the world. This is fate. This is written in the stars. It's how it works. But the poet can fight fate with his poetry, and he sort of gestures toward that in the last couplet and really elaborates on it in the poems that follow. And really, he ends up making a really bold claim, which is that art can resist the stars. I'm happy to talk about those sonnets that follow if anyone cares to later. At the same time, he references the literal skies. Shakespeare also seems to be referencing the early modern theater, where above the actors was a little roof or like a little tiny overhang. And if you were on stage and you looked up at this little roof, this is what you would see. It's the moon painted on there. It's the stars, it's clouds and so on. And it was referred to in the period as the heavens. Let me show you a picture of this is the reconstructed Globe Theater. So as the audience would have been standing there looking at the stage, and maybe I'm going to use this pointer real quick if I can make it work. So this here is the heavens up here. The actors would be standing down here. Here's the heavens. This, you're just getting a close up of this part right here. So there's a kind of doubling as the actors are on stage. They have their heavens they're looking up at. And as you can see, this is an open air theater. So the people in the theater would have been looking up at the skies as well. And that doubling really, I think, brings home the question, are we fated? Is what's going on in the sky controlling us? And that question remained up for debate in the 17th century, and maybe it remains up for debate even now. Okay, so we veered a long way from April the 8th, 2024, eclipse in Bowling Green, Ohio. I realize that's 400 years ago. I've been talking about a bunch of stuff that seems to have nothing to do with anything. Why should you care? Okay, well, that's where we are now. So it's true that the scientific developments I've been talking about are clearly involved in a very unique historical context, one that's not merely reflected or mirrored in the art the day, but rather engaged with, taken a position on by early modern artists. And appreciating that, I think, means a couple of really important things. For one thing, art can do work. It doesn't just simply reflect the world around us. It can make us think about other things in different ways than we had thought about it before. It can challenge us. It can try to sell us on ideas too, right? It can try to sell us on a way of thinking. Two, we can't just write people in the past off as sort of naive idiots. I mean, they had science and they were trying to work through the problems of their day, the hard problems, with the science they had. We're doing the same thing today. And yet at the same time, three, I guess I would say, is that the people of the past were not identical to us. Shakespeare does not speak unproblematically to us today because he and his contemporaries believed certain things that we do not today, and for very good reason. If we keep all of this in mind, I think it invites us to wrestle with the questions that Shakespeare raised in his plays and poems in our own unique context. Namely, these questions: are we fated? If not by the stars, by something else, by our class, by our race, by our gender, by capitalism, by the environment, or do we have the agency to change our destinies? How much do we believe in or doubt science, and why? How empirical is science, and how much is it socially constructed or influenced? What power does art possess to call into question ideas and institutions that seem inevitable and unshakable? Finally, when we feel that the world is disordered, that political, social, environmental disasters are or feel imminent, what do we do? What can we do? What should we do? These are the questions that Shakespeare and his contemporaries were asking in their context, and I think they're the questions we need to be asking in ours. I hope that looking up at the sky next week will be an encouragement for all of us to do just that. Thank you. This is the part where I think we can take questions.
Yes.
Andy, is there time? Okay.
Yes, yeah, sure. Questions?
I did a lot of talking. It's hard to go to yeah, sorry.
I've read some things about how they reconstructed what the globe theater looks like. I'm very excited when you show that picture. I haven't come across that. Is there a drawing or something? How do they know? I saw I had the sort of physical figures with chariots and things. I was curious if there like some sketch of what that looks like.
Yeah, so there was a sketch that you'll see in a lot of textbooks of a theater. It was a visitor from another country. I can't think of the country right now. Anyway, he came to see the open air theater that was very similar to the Globe. It was one called the Swan. And so he drew a picture and we sort of see some details from there. And characters comment on it as well. Sometimes that bit from Romeo and Juliet, it's kind of interesting to think maybe about the actor on the stage being able to look up at his heavens and sort of pull that reference to the stars in Juliet's eyes, kind of right from there. So there's sort of some textual evidence that might suggest it as well, but at least one sketch for sure. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah.
The reconstructed globe is really interesting. And if you get on their website, you can learn lots of details about kind of how they did it and how they raised the money to do it and how they figured it out and just how authentic it really is.
Yeah, it's fascinating. That's a good one to be. So I'm looking for that.
Yeah, it's really cool. They also a few years later did reconstructed an indoor theater, not the open air theater as well. So I think they have notes on that too. So yeah.
It's kind of interesting when you were talking about ellipses way back at the beginning there, that it was indicated in Shakespeare as a blockage, and interruption. I think today ellipses are often used that not with the absence of meaning, but to convey, especially emotions that a writer feels they can't put into words, so they put the ellipse there.
Yeah.
Not thinking that the audience will know you know, what's in that pause and you breathe or some other emotion. Was that done in Shakespeare's day, or is that kind of?
Yeah, I would say the examples I looked at tend to be a little bit more like the King Lear examples that I showed you, where someone is talking and someone else just cuts them off, rather than a kind of trailing off, you know, I mean, yeah, I use those 3 dots all the time. But sometimes I think what you're talking about too is still a kind of gap or loss or quietness on an issue, right? So I think there's a similarity, but yeah, I would say that the examples I've looked at tend to be interruptions. Yeah, and certainly in King Lear, that's true.
Did Shakespeare use like point of view at all to like convey these ideas, like using first person versus like an omniscient narrator? Like, did that come into play?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question because we all want to know what Shakespeare really thought about any of these. I mean, this issue is just one of many, right? So did everyone hear the question? Okay, so the question, let me see if I can rephrase it. Tell me if I get it right, okay. Did Shakespeare use sort of first person point of view? Can we kind of get it, like what he really thought about an issue?
Kind of.
Did he
Like,
use omniscient? I mean, you're sort of asking like, what's the point of view here?
yeah, because like an omniscient narrator is kind of like a god-like narrator that
Sure.
sees all the thoughts. So like, did that come into like some of the fate questions?
Yeah, okay. So again, the question is kind of like, yeah, is there an omniscient narrator? And do we get a sense of like the answer to the question, are we fated or whatever? In plays, we don't see that point of view. We get lots of points of view. And that's one of the things that I think makes drama so interesting. You can read this play by Shakespeare and he can have a character say some really like crazy thing. And then some other characters say exactly the opposite. And you're like, okay, well, what does he think? And, you know, sometimes you can get to the end of the play and think, okay, I think I see which characters were rewarded and how this ends. And I think I can maybe understand where he stood on this issue, but I'm not sure because I could go back and read it again a kind of different way. I think so we don't really have a narrator, I guess is what I would say in drama, in Shakespeare's drama, certainly. The closest we kind of get to a first person anyway is in the sonnets. But I would caution that we not think of Shakespeare as the I in those sonnets, the capital I, you know, that those may or may not be his feelings. We know writers write about their own personal experiences, but we know that they can also fictionalize experiences, right? Or imagine things from other people's perspectives. So I guess the answer is no, we don't get the answer to like where he really stood on this, which to me makes it more interesting to look at that work and to kind of dig around and to sort of put these like bits of text next to each other and kind of have a conversation. It kind of opens a conversation rather than like giving one answer.
One last question.
I think we have one.
Yeah, I kind of worked out chronologically. It's correct. It occurred to me that a lot of overlap between Shakespeare's life and Galileo's life, and I know Shakespeare's very interested in Italy. A lot of his plays are set there, and but remembering right, I think Galileo published his works after Shakespeare's death, so that wouldn't have quite reached that time. Or would he have been aware of that? I guess what I'm asking is how widely distributed were Galileo's ideas at that time in England?
Andy, do you want to talk about this? About the publication date? I mean, because I can tell you about Copernicus, you know, those were definitely in circulation in English while Shakespeare was alive. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Galileo's a little bit of a different story.
Kate maybe can help me on this. I think the telescopic observations were made in 1604, so
Yeah.
contemporary. I think maybe some of the later worldview type writings were more 1620, if I'm remembering right.
1632 is when dialogue was published.
Okay. So post
So that's all
Shakespeare.
after Shakespeare's death. So no, I mean, I guess it's a bit late, right? But all these things are kind of swirling roughly. I was suggesting that they're all sort of swirling at roughly the same time that even Donne can say the new philosophy is called all in doubt, right? And it continues to do so for quite a while. Yeah. Oh, sorry, was that two hands? Did I hallucinate your hand, Bill, or did you have it? I'm sorry.
It's just in the chat. I didn't know somebody was trying to drop a question.
Oh, okay, Andy, how do we do that? Do I just do it on here?
Maybe
Can Kate do it
pull
back
them
there?
up?
Okay.
The chat questions?
No, it's just me asking if people have questions.
Okay. Thanks, Bill.
Well, I was just talking about his topic there. I'm guessing that before the publication, there were rumors. You know, people talked to each other a lot more back then, a lot of information was expressed verbally before the printing. You might have heard something from somebody at a party.
Yeah. He might have heard. I like the idea of Shakespeare at a party, talking about the scientific revolution. I love it. I love it. It's possible. Yeah. And Shakespeare did know, so to come back to that first question too, he did know, he was interested in Italy, but you know, he got a lot of things wrong. He thought that some cities, he would say, had ports and they were like landlocked. So he didn't get everything right, but yeah, he did have a connection to Italy.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
And if you have other questions, don't hesitate to come up and ask. We can make those.
Thank you. I'm glad we got those.
Yeah.
What was the mouse?
I don't know.
We wiggled the mouse and then it worked.
Yeah.
I mean, like, not really sure what happened.
Turn the recording off real quick.